And today's episode is sponsored by us. If you're a fan of this podcast, which I'm hoping you are because you're currently listening to it, we would love for you to check out our 4-part podcast capsule series, It's About the Money, a Real Housewives podcast exclusively available for members of the Society at TFD Premium on YouTube or Patreon. The show is hosted by yours truly and my good friend Erin Lowry of Broke Millennial. If you're a fan of the Real Housewives franchise or reality TV in general, it is, in my opinion, an excellent deep dive into all things housewives and money. Join at the $9.99 tier to get instant access to all 4 episodes, and by joining our premium tier, you also get access to our June podcast series, $40,000 on Shoes, a Sex and the City podcast, which just premiered last week. Click the join button on YouTube to get access to our membership, or click the link in the episode description to join on Patreon. See you there. Hey, my name is Chelsea Fagan, and I'm the founder and CEO of The Financial Diet, a totally independently owned and operated company of women who love to talk about money. Welcome to The Financial Confessions, a weekly show where we talk to people about their personal finances, their professional industry, and how money shapes their lives. You can listen to or watch new episodes of The Financial Confessions every week on YouTube or your preferred streaming platform. You can also support TFD and get exclusive access to our entire catalog of ad-free bonus videos, workshops, Discord community, our book club, and more by joining our members-only community on Patreon or YouTube. Our 2024 goal is to be primarily supported by our incredible community, and joining our membership program is the best way to do that. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of The Financial Confessions. As those who have been following along know, we are currently in the throes of a little mini-series on TFC all about weddings and the wedding industrial complex. We have spoken to someone who went into 5 figures of credit card debt just to attend weddings and to be a bridesmaid, which, although a little insane on its face, is actually not that uncommon at all and is kind of the logical outcome of a wedding culture where passing cost on to the people you love most is just treated as totally normal. We've also spoken to a bride who regrets spending as much as she did on her wedding and wishes that she had eloped. And now I wanted to end this little mini-series by talking to someone who I think has, first of all, a very informed but also very healthy opinion on all things leading up to marriage. In the throes of our objectively out-of-control wedding industrial complex, we often lose sight of the fact that a wedding is literally just a party, and what we're actually there to celebrate and mark the occasion of is a marriage. And for most of us, a marriage is the most consequential decision we will make in our lifetime, one of the most substantial contracts we'll ever enter into, and just generally a legal framework being placed upon our lives that most of us don't even consider when we're in the rush to buy a dress or pick a cake or charge all of our friends thousands of dollars to celebrate with us on a bachelorette trip to Cabo. My guest today is something of an expert in the topic of bringing 2 people together and then, unfortunately, sometimes bringing them apart. He is a former A-list divorce attorney who has gone on to found prenups.com and to write the book, The Prenup Prescription, all about why this is one of the most important things that we all need to do, but frankly often forget to, because the focus tends to be on what the wedding looks like rather than what the marriage feels like. So without further ado, I want to introduce the last guest in our mini-series, all about why prenups are much more important to focus on than weddings, Aaron Thomas.
Thanks for having me, Chelsea. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Okay, so first and foremost, you have been a very high-profile divorce attorney for the majority of your career prior to starting all this prenup business. Can you talk first about why specifically you wanted to become a divorce lawyer, and then what got you involved with all of these very high-profile, high-net-worth divorces?
Yeah. The story about how I became a divorce attorney is it was accidental, really. Not many kids, if any, I think, grow up saying I want to be a divorce lawyer when I grow up. But I was practicing criminal law, and the gentleman who was probably the highest profile divorce attorney in the city of Atlanta, where I live, approached me, offered to double my salary if I would come join him where he had a practice representing celebrities, athletes, all of the biggest names who come through the state of Georgia with family law issues. And so I joined in with his firm and began practicing family law. And the rest, as they say, is history.
In your view, what is the difference between sort of facilitating a divorce between two people who may have, the same net worth, the same assets, similar lifestyles, but one is a more high profile couple than the other? Like, what impact does being high profile have on someone divorcing?
It can impact the divorce in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is that person is likely to have a team of people working with them, possibly a team of advisors. Often they are well capitalized, meaning they have the ability to hire the best representation possible. And sometimes it comes down to the details of each spouse's access to finances in the marriage itself. It's not unusual for in high profile or high net worth cases for one spouse to have much more direct access to money than the other spouse. And sometimes these high profile individuals are able to hire the best help while the other spouse is left kind of scrambling to come up with the money to get representation for the case itself. Um, so that's one way. Another way that it can impact the case is, these cases are filed in the public records. These cases take place in an open courtroom, so anyone can come and visit in on the case. Often the media will give attention to the case, and sometimes these storylines come out that can impact one person or the other, depending on how a tabloid or a news organization looks at the goings on in the case. I mean, we've all heard about Hollywood celebrities, divorces, and a lot of the details of those cases coming out in the media. So all that can certainly have an impact on the litigation as well.
I think for most people, logic would dictate that once a divorce begins, you want to do everything possible to make it as amicable and as smooth as possible. Now, of course, barring situations where maybe someone is genuinely behaving in an abusive way or is dangerous or whatever the case may be, that the goal should be to resolve things quickly, to minimize lawyers' bills, and to sort of steel man the other person, especially if there are children involved. And yet, most of the time, what we hear of divorce, what we see play out, is kind of the opposite of that. And people, I think, go very far in the other direction. And I was recently listening to an interview with someone who had gone through a very messy, contentious divorce 2 decades prior, and it dragged it out for a very long time. And it was like a really, really difficult battle in the moment. And she was saying that looking back, she doesn't even recognize the person that she was during that period. I guess my question is, seeing it up close, especially with people in the public eye who can take this to an extreme, what is it about divorce that sort of makes people sort of become this version of themselves and makes them so hostile to the idea of, an amicable, fast, inexpensive resolution?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. I actually don't think that most people who find themselves in these heavily contested divorces are dismissing the idea of getting the divorce over quickly. I mean, in the probably 1,000 divorce cases I've done over the past 2 decades, I can't recall really anybody coming to me and saying, I want a long, drawn out, expensive, messy divorce. Everybody would like it over with quickly, but they want it over with quickly on the terms that they feel are fair to them. And I think that's where the rub is. In 41 out of the 50 states in the US, the laws are that of equitable division, which means that the judge is authorized to divide the marital assets equitably, but that doesn't necessarily mean equally, right? And so the court can divide your estate 60-40 or 70-30 or 80-20, depending on that judge's kind of view, subjective as it may be, of each spouse's contributions to the marriage, both financial and non-financial contributions. And the dynamic of a divorce is the couple, they're no longer communicating well. Potentially they don't respect each other any longer, and they're basically communicating through the lawyers. And it's just, I think, human nature when you're asked, who did what in the relationship. Even in a relationship that is truly 50-50, each spouse is likely to feel like they did two-thirds of the work or three-fourths of the work, because we see the contributions that we make ourselves. And particularly when a relationship is broken down, we are likely to either not see or potentially dismiss the contributions of the other spouse. And so I don't necessarily think that these people have become awful human beings. I think that they're communicating through lawyers, and who's better, for better or worse, the incentives of the lawyers are not to get it over with quickly. They make more money the longer that the case drags out. And even though I don't think they're purposely dragging cases out or running up bills, it's just very easy when you're in touch with one person, you see the contributions that your client made. And both spouses are likely to feel like, I deserve 60% of the assets. I deserve two-thirds of the assets. And that makes it very difficult to come to an agreement in the middle, when it's your financial future on the line, when it's the amount of contact you're going to have with your kids on the line. Nothing could be more personal and critical to someone's future than those things. And it doesn't lend itself to easy, amicable resolutions.
Have you ever had to say to a client, some version of, you have to let this one go, like seeing people being outlandishly petty about things that are making the process unnecessarily difficult?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that it is very easy for someone going through a divorce to end up trying to use the outcome of the divorce as a referendum on who was the more virtuous spouse during the marriage itself. And there's this tendency to want to win the divorce case, when in all actuality there's unlikely to be a win in the context of a divorce. You have income that used to support one household that now supports two households. Everyone takes a hit in their standard of living and access to resources. You go from living in the same house with your children 365 days a year to now, half or sometimes less than that amount of time. And so it's easy to get drawn into this idea of, I'm proving, who was right in the relationship or who was the good spouse in the relationship, rather than treating it like this is a process that we have to get through and we just need to treat each other fairly and get to the other side of it as quickly and cleanly as possible. So it's difficult.
Well, on the subject of prenups, the focus of this little mini series has been, um, wedding culture just kind of encouraging a lot of financial behavior that I think people would otherwise not engage in, because there's just not that environment that's justifying everything, that's heightening everything. And it's really interesting to me that, in the case of a lot of weddings, I mean, weddings cost tens of thousands of dollars. In places like New York City, where I live, they can easily get up to $100,000. And in many cases, I mentioned in one of the interviews that I know people personally who've spent, well into the five figures on a wedding and who have serious student debt. So they're literally taking resources that could be sort of liberating them financially and putting them toward, essentially just a party. And yet I think that the culture around making weddings this big spectacle is only really heightening. And for as much as we've gotten more financially literate on a lot of issues, I feel like this is the one area where we really struggle with making healthy financial decisions. As someone who's really an expert in them, why do you think prenups are just not really a part of the culture leading up to a marriage the way a wedding is?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you make a great point that people certainly dedicate a lot more of their financial resources to planning the wedding than they do maybe planning the marriage itself. And I think they spend a lot of their mental resources on planning one day rather than, in my view, what is their financial life going to look like over the course of their entire marriage. I think that prenups specifically are difficult because of a lot of the stigma that comes along with it. I mean, you can't have a conversation about prenuptial agreements without addressing the stigma that comes along with prenups. I mean, we've heard all of kind of the ideas that you're planning for your divorce before your marriage even starts, or they're not romantic, or people think that they're only for the very wealthy. And a lot of these very common misconceptions keep people from doing what would otherwise be, I think, a very common sense thing for people to do, to kind of customize their marital contract. You know, as you very aptly put it, the most important financial contract that any of us are ever going to sign in our lives is getting married. And it is not a one size fits all type of relationship. And I think if more couples looked at it as we are customizing our financial relationship for something that works for us, rather than kind of this public perception that it's planning for your divorce before your marriage even starts, that more couples would start doing it. And in fact, more and more couples are entering into prenuptial agreements before they get married, but it's still, I think it's gone from somewhere around 3% 20 years ago to about 15% today. So there's still a long way to go.
Would you say that if a person proposes a prenup to someone they're engaged to and the person won't do it, or, you know, just essentially refuses to do it, would you say not to marry that person?
I think that has to be considered one of the options, certainly, depending on what type of situation you're in. I think that I am probably a little bit more forgiving when people are initially opposed to the idea of prenups, because before I practiced family law, I had the same misconceptions that so many people do, you know, in the public today, that I thought they were, you know, I thought it was just a plan for the divorce. I didn't know that prenups could cover how you manage your finances during the marriage itself. I literally thought that you were just splitting up your assets before you accumulated them, and that they were only for the very wealthy. So I think that a lot of the misconceptions about prenups keep people or give people kind of that visceral reaction or opposition to prenups. And so I think that a lot of effort should be made to communicate to the person that you want to spend your life with the reasons why you want a prenup. What is it you're trying to accomplish with the agreement, rather than focusing just on the word prenup itself? Some people hear that and they're immediately like a no. But I think if you were breaking down, here's what it is that I want to accomplish, here's how I believe that a prenup can protect both of us, that a lot more people would come around to the idea or be open to getting a prenup.
Well, one of the issues that I think a lot of people have with them is they, I think, don't understand how comprehensive they can be. And something we've talked a lot before about on the show is how often the uneven division of domestic labor can really penalize women in hetero marriages. And a very, very common dynamic, which I'm sure you've seen countless times, is a man who leans into his career after having children, whose earning potential increases, a woman who either partially or wholly kind of takes herself out of her earning potential, out of her career, but is doing the work of running the household, raising the children, you know, essentially being sort of the chief of staff of their life. But that is not something that our culture values as labor. And it's not something that, you know, obviously if women unexpectedly have to re-enter the workforce in the case of a divorce or whatever it may be, or if, you know, they just need more money, that's not really something that, you know, you can sort of boost up a resume with. So it really puts women at a huge disadvantage. And I'm interested to know, kind of from both the perspective of seeing that play out in divorces, and also preparing people to enter marriages, you know, how do you see that impacting people, and how can people, especially women, protect themselves from that dynamic if that's, you know, a lifestyle choice that they're likely to make?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that is one of the most important things that um, people in our position need to educate the public about, because a lot of people look at a prenup as something that can only protect the higher earning spouse. And really, sometimes the person who needs the most protection is someone who is going to play more of the role of the homemaker. and not be able to have the ability to focus on their career. It's really, for a lot of the women that I've worked with over the years, they're sacrificing not just their ability to earn income in the interim or during the marriage itself. They're sacrificing potentially the direct access to money, something that you can address in a prenup. How is the money going to flow? Where is the income going to go in terms of the bank accounts? And getting on the same page in terms of, an understanding of all these assets that are being accumulated by the couple over the course of the marriage, ensuring that you're on the same page with your spouse, that these assets belong to the both of us equally, and not just the person whose name is on the retirement account, or who, is the primary earner that's putting money into the brokerage account. Because as will be no shock to you, when these couples get divorced, all of a sudden, the man, the husband who benefited from having the wife by his side and being the chief of staff of the relationship all this time, is very likely to devalue that labor, to devalue the contributions made by his wife over the course of the marriage, and try to fight to keep the majority of the assets to themselves. And then a lot of these homemakers, often the women, find themselves in a position where not only have they been away from the workforce for 10, 15, sometimes more years, and they've reduced their ability to earn income for the rest of their lives, but now they're in a divorce case where the person on the other side is trying to keep them from even getting half of the assets that were accumulated during the marriage itself. And so I think that if you're going to take a break from the workforce, if you're going to put your career on the back burner for what you believe is the good of your family, for the good of your marriage, that there needs to be a negotiation that takes place, where, number one, you need to understand, are my contributions to this relationship being valued on an equal level? Are we in agreement that everything that we accumulate over the course of our relationship belongs to the two of us? And yes, let's talk about alimony. If I am putting myself in a vulnerable position when it comes to my ability to earn income in the future, how would I be taken care of? How am I going to have access to money if this relationship comes to an end? And I think that these are very important things for couples to think about when entering marriage.
One of the things that I think is particularly insidious about the explosion in our wedding culture, and how, I mean, these things have grown hugely in cost, in scope, the number of events, the amount people are spending, the way it's playing out on social media, is how much pressure it puts on couples to go through with marriages that they may otherwise be uncertain about. Because it becomes, more and more of, first of all, there's an inertia of it, there's a sunk cost fallacy, and there's also the even more public embarrassment. I mean, it's one thing if you have to tell family and friends, it's another thing if you have to post to however many social media followers, oh, just kidding, I'm actually not getting married. And yet, I think a lot of us, most of us maybe, have been to a wedding where we're like, yeah, I don't think this is going to go the long haul. And in some cases, they might already be divorced. You're laughing. I know you've definitely been to some of those as well. In your mind, having been through so many divorces, do you have, early warning signs, things that people might want to consider in the lead up to getting married, to really take a step back and be like, ooh, maybe I should just call it now, kind of a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I always say, and this is my observation from all the divorce cases that I've been involved with over the years, is that things don't go wrong, they start wrong. And it applies to a lot of things in life, but certainly I think it applies to marital relationships. And I think that a lot of the important conversations often don't happen until the lead up to the wedding. Particularly, in my work doing prenuptial agreements, people do not have transparency when it comes to their financial lives. Often, in the very couple of months leading up to their relationship, marriage is a financial partnership. Yes, it's an emotional partnership. It is a life partner. It's a family partnership, someone to raise children with. It's a sexual partnership, but it is also a legal and financial partnership. And you wouldn't go into business with another person. You wouldn't merge your business with another person's business without having real transparency and disclosures when it comes to the finances. And the same thing when you're getting married. If you are not on the same page financially, if you are not compatible financially in terms of how you've structured your financial lives, that is a big potential red flag. I mean, it's no surprise. We all know that fights about money are one of the biggest things that breaks up couples, one of the leading causes of divorce today. And unfortunately, laying out your net worth statement isn't it's not something that's going to come up on the first date, but often it doesn't come up on the third date or the 10th date. And so we see couples going down the aisle who have no idea if their spouse is carrying 6 figures of IRS debt or 50 grand of credit card debt. Sometimes the wedding itself makes things worse because you're racking up additional debt going into the wedding. And so certainly not having transparency about, I think finance is a symptom, but other parts of your lives before you walk down the aisle is a big factor in couples not realizing that they're incompatible leading up to their wedding.
Something I think about a lot is that, and I think most of us have heard this anecdote now about how it's so common for men to leave their wives when they fall ill or get diagnosed with a serious illness, that's something that they will often warn women about in the hospital. That it's statistically vastly more likely for a man to leave a woman in case of serious illness than the other way around in hetero partnerships and marriages. And, obviously that's extremely depressing. And, if someone were to do that to me, yeah, I'm murdering them. Neither of us are getting out of that illness alive, as my friend once put it. And it sounds so outlandish in, when everything's going well. But reading about that phenomenon really always makes me think about how I think the vows in a wedding are often, I think, really not, we don't even really think about them. We don't understand them. We don't really know what we're saying when we say, I'm with you until we die, essentially. I'm with you through any adversity. And I'm wondering, especially in part of leading up to a wedding, thinking about prenups, thinking about, our financial health, what is some guidance that you would give to a couple to make sure that they really understand what they're committing to when they agree to the wedding vows, and that they really sort of are doing the psychological exercises as best they can to understand whether or not they're actually ready?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. One of the things certainly that I think that all couples should do is disclose everything, be transparent when it comes to their finances. That would be the first step. Put everything down in writing. It's not enough just to talk about these things, but also to go the next step and say, okay, how are we going to manage our money during the marriage itself? Is all of our incomes going to go into one joint bank account? Are they going to go into separate bank accounts and then we both contribute to a joint bank account from there? What's our access to money going to be? Do both of us have access to the same amount of money? Do we both get the kind of the same allowance or spending money during the marriage itself? And are we in agreement that all of the money that we earn, is that going to be considered 50-50? All the retirement accounts, regardless of name they're in. What about the debts that we're bringing into the relationship? Are those going to be considered kind of our separate debts, or are they joint debts? I think really having a conversation about what do we consider mine, what's yours, and what's ours will give a lot of insight into how each spouse is viewing the relationship. Again, the finances may just be the canary in the coal mine. It may be, something that is the symptom and not the underlying cause. But I think that answering those questions as a couple will give these people a lot of insight who are going into marriage, giving them a lot of insight into how does their spouse view them? Is this a true partnership where each of us are 50-50, or are we kind of living our separate lives, but we're sharing a house? Are we more of a roommate type situation? One of the things that I say is, you can't have two spouses living under the same roof, but in different socioeconomic classes. And if the way that you are structuring your lives, your financial lives, your working lives, puts you in a situation where you're going to be in different classes, and that is going to play out in other areas of your life as well. If they don't respect your contributions to the relationship, are they going to respect your ability to be a true 50-50 partner, to have a say in the choices that you make, where you live, whether you move, who works, what kinds of hours, your roles in terms of the domestic labor on the home front or raising children. And a lot of those things may not be obvious when you're still in the hearts aflutter stage, the butterflies in the stomach stage of the relationship. But getting serious about having those kind of difficult, sometimes difficult conversations about your financial lives, I think will give hints towards the future of the relationship itself.
And in terms of identifying patterns, because like you said earlier, things don't get bad, they start bad, or I can't remember how you phrased it. It was more eloquent than that. But, that in general, the problems that are going to arise that may eventually culminate in a divorce are probably things that were in some form present leading up to the wedding. That it's not a total shock. I mean, rarely do people just completely change their personality types or what have you. Now, I want to set aside that obviously sometimes there are grave circumstances that, change things. And there are obviously extreme cases where, let's say someone was having an affair or, they were abusive or, any of those sort of, let's say, force majeure kind of situations. But I would have to imagine that a huge amount of divorces arise out of just kind of a gradual and more low grade level of incompatibility that kind of accumulates and worsens over the years. I would really be interested to know, in your years of being a divorce attorney, what are some of the most common patterns you see in terms of those sort of fundamental character incompatibilities that eventually crescendo into a divorce, but were likely already visible to some extent in the run up to a wedding?
Yeah, yeah. I think that, the health of a relationship can really come down a lot of times to communication. In my book, I talk about kind of the three fundamentals of a good prenup, but they may also be the three fundamentals of a healthy marriage: transparency, communication, and fairness. And I think that, so many divorces can really be traced back to a breakdown in the ability to communicate. And it may be seen as, small lacks of transparency here and there, financial infidelity, as we sometimes term it, in terms of, not sharing all the finances or information, or your paycheck is not going into a place where both spouses can see it. One spouse doesn't have information about, where is the money, where are the finances. You might be shocked, maybe not you, but some of the viewers would likely be shocked of how many couples are married 10, 15, 20 or more years and don't know where the money is. They don't have any idea of what the couple owns in terms of assets. Sometimes they don't even know where their spouse banks. They don't know how much their spouse makes. And so if these things aren't being communicated, another thing that I like to say is that the financial dynamics of a marriage reveal the personal dynamics of a marriage. And so if there's a lack of transparency and communication happening in these areas of your relationship, it is likely bleeding over into other areas of your relationship as well. And so, one of the things that we try to talk with couples about is putting in place a strategy for resolving conflict during your marriage. One of the most common clauses that become super popular in the prenuptial agreements that we're drafting these days are requirements that the couple go to counseling. Maybe it's a minimum number of counseling sessions together each year during the relationship, or a lot of couples will put in place something that says uh, once a year, either one of us can trigger 3 counseling sessions, 5 marriage counseling sessions, and couples will agree ahead of time that they don't have to agree on it at the time, that a spouse brings it up. But they're agreeing ahead of time. If either one of us wants to go to counseling, we're agreeing ahead of time that either one of us has the ability to trigger these counseling sessions, so that you have a framework that makes it more likely for you to be able to communicate about issues, to resolve issues as they arise, rather than allow these kind of small transparencies to fester and turn into big acts of infidelity, whether it's sexual infidelity or financial infidelity or just lying and lack of transparency overall in the relationship.
I always feel like the dynamics, I mean, I think your point about the financial dynamics being just sort of a microcosm of the overall personal dynamics, I think is spot on. But I also think the wedding often becomes a microcosm of the couple's dynamic. And what's notable to me about weddings, especially in our culture, is that it's very rarely the case, I think, at least anecdotally. I mean, we hear from people all the time who regret spending as much as they did. But often in the run up to this big life event, it's usually one person that is driving a lot of these decisions, a lot of these, spending choices, logistical choices. And I don't want to generalize, girlies, but it's often us because we are being so heavily marketed to and targeted with this industry, and we're receiving so many narratives about it. But what's so interesting that often plays out is you have one partner who has a very specific vision that has huge financial implications and is sort of, moving it along while the other party is just kind of along for the ride. I mean, it's a cliche at this point, but, the bored husband, walking through the venue or at the cake tasting, or, you show up to the wedding and he's like, yeah, she really poured her whole heart and soul into this. And he was just sitting around having a beer with his friends, kind of a vibe. And I always think that dynamic that you can often see play out, especially in a lot of these weddings that really kind of spiral financially, to me, that just seems like, wow, this is a real glimpse into how a lot of different choices in your life are probably going to unfold.
I think that is spot on. I think it's such a great observation. It really is. And it's funny to me because so much of the opposition that I sometimes hear to prenuptial agreements is it's unsexy to have this financial negotiation and uncomfortable to have this financial negotiation at the beginning of our relationship, when in truth, it's the planning of the wedding that is often your first test in terms of your ability to have this financial negotiation between the two spouses. In terms of, what road does it take? Is one person kind of, bulldozing the other one in determining, how much financial outlay is going to happen for this one day? And does that actually set the tone and create the seeds of resentment in the relationship? Certainly as it pertains to finances, but like we're talking about in many other aspects of the relationship. And does that set couples on a course for dysfunctional relationships with their finances and otherwise?
Yes. And I also think it really sort of drives home a lot of narratives we have about gender going into a marriage, which I think then become kind of magnified and amplified throughout the marriage. I mean, this positioning as like, the woman should be the one concerned with all of these, I mean, let's be honest, rather frivolous things objectively, and that it's a reflection on her as a person, and, that the husband's just kind of along for the ride. We see that play out all the time in the actual marriage, and I think it's not that different from the social dynamics that lead to, the woman often being totally cut out of the couple's finances and not knowing what's really going on and stepping back from her career and having no protection over a completely ruined earning potential. I think there's just, it's interesting to me that we've gotten to a place where women are quite equally represented almost in the workforce, and certainly in education. Women are often more educated than men. We've really changed that dynamic. And yet when it comes to marriage, and especially in the lead up to marriage and in wedding culture, there's really these very, very retrograde gender dynamics that I think we're sort of pushing people into this union with a very backwards idea of what it looks like to be a couple.
Yeah, yeah. I think that, you hit on something important where, there's been this transition in society of, what a relationship is and, each gender's roles in these relationships, certainly, in hetero relationships. And I think that as a society, we're still navigating, where things shake out. One of the things that when I was doing the research for my book and looking into kind of, the history of marriage, like how did we even get here? And you realize that our kind of modern romantic concept of marriage is a pretty recent thing. And you don't have to go back that far to see, when marriage was not equal relationship. And we think about two people becoming one as, that's this romantic ideal that we have in marital relationships. Two people becoming one. We're joined together, we're uniting, we're now one person. And where that came from is legally, the woman ceased to exist as a legal entity when marrying the husband. She came under, and this is in the case law. I mean, this came down from English common law, but it's also in U.S. laws as late as the early 1900s, where when a woman gets married, she loses the ability to own property on her own. She, takes on the husband's name, and even spouses being introduced as Mr. and Mrs. insert husband's full name here and no part of the wife's name there is a symbol of that's a vestige of this time when the woman ceased to exist as a financial entity. And so, you fast forward to today. I mean, a lot of those things carried over. And men through the courting process are expected to, pay for the dates. And the woman doesn't have a lot of visibility into the man's finances. And then some of that carries over into relationships. And even though society, at least we like to think that society has progressed beyond this stage of, men earn all the money and women are simply the homemakers. A lot of couples, I think, still get caught in these traditional sometimes outdated gender norms where, the husband is the manager of the finances. And, what right does the woman have to even encroach on that domain? And so I think that, marriage is harder than it's ever been before. If you look at, marriage in the 1960s, even compared to marriage today, couples back then, they got married at age 21. There was likely one income in the household. There was likely just one bank account. And then you look at couples today who are getting married closer to age 30 on average for a first marriage. A lot of us older than that. And there's likely two incomes, and each spouse is coming in with 4 or 5 bank accounts, 3 or 4 credit cards, maybe some property, maybe ownership in a business. And it is just, the 1960s marriage is like a startup business in your garage, two people coming together and building everything from scratch. And you look at today's marriage, and it's a corporate merger in terms of complexity, bringing together not just the assets, not just the debts, but the financial habits that each spouse has built up individually over the course of their lives since they moved out of their parents' house. And now we're expected to just come together with all of these preconceptions and gender norms and, financial habits and merge that together smoothly into this one union. And it's a lot of pressure to put on a relationship, particularly when we're not very good about having these conversations and talking about, what does this, financial contract really going to look like? What does this marital contract look like for us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there that I think is really important. And I mean, to your point about marriage historically being something where women essentially cease to exist, or in some ways never existed, right? Because they went from being property of their father to property of their husband. This is just a personal side note, but I love my father. He's my favorite person. But I was like, Dad, I don't want you to present me to my husband. I think that's just a very strange, I just don't like that dynamic. We'll find another way to like have a special moment. But it does, when I see that happen, and listen, everyone's different. I totally understand. But it is a very shockingly sort of literal symbol of how much marriage used to be literally just a father bequeathing a woman onto another man, which again, I don't know, gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, honestly. But I do think you're right that there is, even in the dating stage, there are so many vestiges of that culture and that dynamic that remain in these relationships. And yet, again, women are in a position where they are usually bringing very substantial assets, income, financial history into this relationship. So it's sort of the worst of both worlds. When it comes to, the divorces that you've seen, where women do find themselves in these really disadvantaged financial positions. I mean, once the divorce goes through, I mean, you may be able to fight to turn them back on. But, if a woman doesn't even know where the bank account is, she could immediately lose access to all of the, day-to-day money to live. Are there things that you think that these women could and should have done differently during the marriage to protect themselves? Obviously, the men should have been doing a lot differently, but let's just assume that they're not good faith actors in a lot of these cases. Like, how are women not protecting themselves?
Yeah, yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there that both spouses should be taking actions. But I think that couples should demand transparency when it comes to the finances of the relationship. To the extent that they can. It's one of the reasons that I'm such a big proponent of prenuptial agreements is because in all 50 states, for a prenup to be enforceable, each spouse has to disclose all of their assets and debts to each other, typically in writing, typically, in a net worth statement attached to the agreement itself. And I think that once that wall has been broken down in terms of financial transparency at the beginning of a relationship, it's a much easier sell to expect that information be updated over the course of the relationship. Very common clause in prenups these days is something that I'll call like the annual shareholders meeting, where the couple has a financial meeting of the household at a minimum once a year, where they sit down and update each other on here are our incomes, here's the status of our investments, here's how we're looking in terms of retirement, here's what our spending looks like, here's our budget for the upcoming year, and really involving both spouses in those conversations rather than just taking hands off and saying, well, they manage the finances and I manage this part of the relationship. That division of labor really leaves people vulnerable, not just in the event of a divorce, but during the marriage itself. Spouses are vulnerable. And so I think, setting out that kind of expectation that if this is a true partnership, you see, I like to use these business analogies, but if you're a shareholder of the company, then you have access to the finances. If I am part of this union, part of this financial contract that we put together here, then I have the right to look at the books and see where we are and have input on our investment approach, our retirement approach, the big financial decisions that we make. Another common thing that couples will put in their agreements these days that I think can protect both spouses is any financial decision that's over $500, over $1,000, both of us get a say before those decisions are made. And having that kind of expectation, I think, necessitates a certain level of transparency in the relationship, and can, I think, put both spouses on more of an even footing, an even playing field when it comes to we are both making the decisions for this household, not just the person who has more zeros in their paycheck.
Well, what is interesting too is like, as much as, weddings and marriages used to be so different from a gender perspective, I mean, we really can't forget the fact that it is very new and socially unusual for so many marriages to be happening across class lines. Like, that just never used to be the case. In fact, anyone who reads Regency romance will know that one of the biggest plot points in all of those books, depending on the book, is people falling in love outside of their class station. Like, that used to be like, that would destroy a family. That was like, those marriages couldn't happen. They were socially completely taboo. And people generally always married within their own class system. And there are remnants of that, obviously, especially depending on your social class. I mean, and in many other cultures, it definitely plays a more substantial role to this day. But it is becoming more and more socially acceptable and common for people of two different social classes to marry each other. And I think there is, on the one hand, I mean, it's always nice to marry into a love match and to, not be so concerned with being exact equals financially. But I do think there's a real naivety around the inherent imbalances and problems that that can cause. And the fact that, you know, there has historically been a reason why a lot of these marriages were more financial arrangements between families, because ultimately there's a lot more that goes into a marriage than just loving each other. I'm really interested, you know, how did these class disparities play out in your experience as a divorce attorney?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really important point that you bring up. Marriage historically, a lot of times was a way to preserve wealth. It was an arrangement that was made through the families, even if they weren't strictly arranged marriages. Marriages, parents, and other people, the extended family, had a lot larger say in who you marry, how you marry, when you marry than happens today. Now we think of it as just kind of like an individual personal decision, and mom and dad, I'm going to marry whoever I love. But a lot of these other, some would say more, kind of practical aspects were, much larger roles in marriage previously. My experience, my observation is that it's not just about the amount of money or the amount of wealth that each spouse has, but their outlook, the way that they view, their financial practices, their financial habits. I mean, bleeds out into, their investment approaches and how they look at their careers and what type of house to buy. And, whether you're putting your money into, real estate or the stock market. And having, incompatibility on a lot of those levels can certainly be the breeding ground for one spouse taking kind of a dominant role in the relationship and cutting the other spouse out of the information and out of the decision making altogether. Again, certainly it may start with the finances, but it can lead to it being one person kind of controlling the entire relationship altogether. And I think that's something that these spouses, these couples, where there's disparate wealth, disparate social classes coming in, that they really have to look out for is, ensuring that one spouse doesn't end up kind of dominating the whole relationship and it ends up resembling some of those, what you might call the more traditional marriages where it's more of, the man is in charge, not just of the bank accounts, but of the relationship and the woman altogether.
So, one of the things that we hear a lot when it comes to making not great decisions financially going into a wedding and having a wedding that you don't necessarily feel great about, or having these costs spiral, is the role that family often plays. And, oftentimes, even if the family is not paying for it anymore the way they used to in prior, historical times, they're still exerting a huge amount of say in, all of the particulars of the wedding, which again, kind of a worst of both worlds scenario. And I think a lot of people really struggle with setting boundaries as it pertains to family, and especially as it pertains to in-laws who feel even more, I think, intimidating, frankly. And I have to imagine that family can often play a role in either eventually leading up to a divorce or in making a divorce more acrimonious, more stressful, etc. Do you have advice for people on setting boundaries and being able to have a clear inner voice when it comes specifically to navigating family pressure, both in the context of a wedding and then also just throughout the marriage and even perhaps an eventual divorce?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that certainly in the couples that I've worked with who are going into their marriages, people who are preparing a prenup, the role of family plays a large factor. I mean, when you ask somebody, what are the things that scare you about your marriage? What are the potential downfalls? The roles that family play are a big one on that, are a top item on that list. So, one of the things that couples find it beneficial to talk about is what's our financial relationship going to be to our family? Are there expectations about family contributing money, or are we expected to give money out to family members? And some couples will set rules of, saying we're never going to loan or gift family money over $500, or setting some kind of limit and having that be an explicit agreement for both spouses so that when family comes in, they can say, we have a rule in our relationship, maybe even in our prenup, that we don't loan money out over $500 to family members. And the same kind of thing can extend to other areas where families get involved. We're not going to have family members come live with us unless it is, agreed to by both spouses. Or we may have a blanket rule that, family can't stay with us for more than, a week or 3 days. And I think when you start broaching some of those topics, it can put the couple on the same side of the negotiation and not, I am here and I'm against you and your mom and your dad, or vice versa. And recognizing that it's you as the union, it's you as the couple that is making the decisions rather than, and you're protecting each other from your respective families. And putting yourselves first as a couple, and allowing your spouse to have permission to draw boundaries between you as a couple and the other family member. And hopefully that extends over to, the wedding itself. Again, it really is that first big test of negotiation that you're going to have as a couple. Can you put yourself in a position where your spouse feels good about the wedding, about the financial outlay, about the role that family plays into it? And getting ahead of that, I think, is going to yield dividends, not just for the wedding itself, but for your marriage.
Yeah. And to your earlier point, I think it's, if these conversations can't really be navigated in a healthy, open way, and if you struggle with communication on these things, like, does not bode well for how the rest of the marriage is likely to go. Kind of as a final thought, the point of this sort of wedding mini series was to hopefully make all of us kind of take a step back and think a little bit more clear-headedly about the financial chaos that is often going into and leading up to a wedding. Unfortunately now, both for the couple and anyone involved in the wedding, it's becoming more and more of a financial imposition. And we've talked a lot about the role that a prenup should play and the things that it can cover, and the way that it is just as much for the less financially privileged person in the marriage than the one who has more assets. But what would your advice be to someone who is in the lead up, in the planning stages of their own wedding, and feeling like the wedding culture, the wedding frenzy is kind of taking over and making them sort of lose sight of what is actually important to them? What are some practices and some habits that you would suggest for them to sort of reclaim their clear-headed financial thinking going into their wedding?
Yeah, I think one part of it is, don't make decisions in the context of your wedding that you wouldn't want that to be the practice for making decisions in your marriage itself. Rather than putting, the wedding in this vacuum and saying, oh, this is for, this spouse, or this is really for, the wife, or it's for her family, using that as the first opportunity to say, okay, as a couple, how are we going to make decisions in our relationship? Are we going to come together and make these decisions jointly and talk about what's important for both of us and develop a strategy for resolving differences when they arise? Or are we going to let one person, dominate this discussion and then set the precedent so that later on in the relationship, that spouse or even the other spouse feels like they have carte blanche to do the same thing and railroad decisions over the other spouse that they may feel like they have a preference on? And so, back to your earlier point, I think it really can be used as somewhat of a microcosm of your ability to be able to make decisions as a couple and to define what the dynamics of your relationship are going to be far beyond the wedding day.
So our audience is obviously savvy, smart. They're definitely going to be getting a prenup before they get married. Where should people go to start their process getting a prenup?
Yeah, come visit us at prenups.com. We've got a free ebook, 7 Steps to a Marriage Saving Prenup, that you can download if you want to get an overview, plenty of videos, links out to our social media channel. And there's also a link on the website to buy the book if you really want to do a deep dive. The prenup prescription is available on Amazon. You can find links to all of that at the website, prenups.com.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for joining us. And thank you all at home for watching. And we will see you back here next Monday on an all new episode of the Financial Confessions. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us, and be sure to tune in next week for an all-new episode of The Financial Confessions. The Financial Confessions is created by The Financial Diet and hosted by me, Chelsea Fagan. It is produced by Alexa Brooks-Major and Holly Trantham. Recording and editing by Emily Fisher, and music and sound effects are from Epidemic Sound. Want more of our content? Head over to our YouTube page, The Financial Diet, to see our monthly deep dives, videos of this show, and our entire backlog of videos and podcasts. I'll talk to you next week.